Hello everyone, we're starting off tonight with something a bit less philosophical, but no less intriguing. The cuisine of saloons in the Wild West. They had a reputation for bar fights, booze, and dubious piano music. But what did patrons eat there? Was it just bacon and beans? Or were those swinging doors concealing surprises? Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from around the globe, so please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. The fragrance was the first thing you noticed when you entered a Wild West saloon, not the piano music or the sound of someone squandering a week's salary at cards. Forget about the idealized aroma of freshly baked cornbread and searing steak. The actual bouquet was more akin to a nasal punch: wet tobacco, old beer, damp wood, sweaty cowboys, horses that hadn't taken a bath in 10 years, and, if you were lucky, the tiniest whiff of anything cooking in the back. It was a complex mix. Some saloons attempted to cover it up with pipe smoke so thick that it temporarily impairs memory or sawdust on the floor. Others simply accepted it. Bartenders would use a rag that hadn't been cleaned since the Civil War to smack flies off the counter and declare, "You don't come here for the air." Nevertheless, there was always a kitchen somehow. A pan of beans might have been simmering over embers in a hole in the wall. It may have been a sullen woman wearing an apron covered in soot, using a spoon that doubled as a weapon for self-defense to stir mystery stew. But somewhere, food was being prepared, and you were halfway to dinner if you could smell it through the alcohol vapor and perspiration. If you could find a seat, that is. The majority of saloons were not designed like contemporary eateries. There were only a few splintered tables, a few decrepit chairs, no servers, no menus with scripted fonts, and one long counter where you could eat, drink, argue, or do all three at once. If you were a regular, you might shout out your decision without looking up when the cook said something like, "beans or stew." They would look you down if you were new to the area, attempting to determine if you would pay or faint before the plate was placed on the table. And that's what made dining in a saloon so unique. It was about survival, not about flavor. Instead of eating what you desired, you ate what they had. Strangers who could rob you or save your life tomorrow sat next to you. And whiskey was there for that if the food made you sick. Beans were at the top of the Wild West culinary hierarchy, not because they were particularly good, but rather because they were inexpensive, unbreakable, and able to withstand a stampede, a gunfight, and the end of the world without suffering any hardship. Navy beans, black beans, or pinto beans made no difference. It ended up in the saucepan if it was dry, somewhat edible, and boiled to mush. Served morning, noon, and night, beans were the unsung heroes of saloon kitchens, frequently to men who hadn't seen a vegetable since leaving Kansas. It was easy to prepare. First, fill a pot with beans. The second step is to boil them over a dubious heat for 6 hours. Step 3. Serve them with a stale biscuit, salt pork, and a pitying expression. Most cooks didn't bother, but others tried to be fancy by adding lard, onions, or even chili powder if they were feeling really ambitious. Flavor was a luxury in the Wild West, and seasoning was whatever came in through the open window. Cowboys valued beans more than gold because they were dependable, filling, and hearty. Long cattle drives, poker nights, and waiting for someone to be thrown through the front window or for the piano player to start up again were all powered by them. The sole drawback? The aftermath. It was acceptable for one cowboy to eat beans. A biological weapon was 10 cowboys in a saloon full of beans. Some bar fights are claimed to have started with a single, silent, but fatal betrayal close to the stove rather than insults. Beans, however, were reliable. The beans were unaffected, unburned, and unaltered even after the meat ran out, the fowl went away, and the cook had precisely 7 brain cells left from the whiskey fumes. They were even preferred by some cowboys. They might be used as temporary money in an emergency, eaten cold and warmed indefinitely. According to legend, a man once promised never to return after purchasing a horse with 3 pounds of salted beans. Yes, there were highs and lows to saloon cuisine, but beans? The foundation, the basis, and the modest beating heart of 1,000 dusty meals were beans. Sometimes respect was sufficient, even if you didn't love them. Salt pork, a slab of fat and meat so hardy that it could withstand a thunderstorm, a bar fight, and 6 months in a saddlebag without altering texture was the slightly greasier backbone of Wild West saloon cuisine, if beans were its soul. Cowboys loved to pretend that salt pork was bacon, but it wasn't. It was pork belly that had been stored in barrels with enough brine to season a small ocean, severely salted and frequently smoked. In addition to preventing it from rotting, the salt may have prevented it from being edible. Salt pork was acceptable when cooked properly. It had flavor, fat, and that wonderful crunch that temporarily made you forget the rest of your dinner was from a can. It was served crispy and sizzling after being fried in a hot skillet. It was like chomping on a salted boot heel soaked in axle grease when it was cooked incorrectly, which was frequently the case. Salt pork did have its supporters, though. It provided a salty blast of ecstasy to even the most boring pot of beans, or at least a reason to drink more whiskey. It was also easy to transport and difficult to destroy, though many tried. Saloon cooks wasted nothing at all. Everything from biscuits to potatoes is fried in this grease. The rinds were added to stews, fed to dogs, or given to unfortunate visitors who were unaware of the distinction. When the bartender said, "Chew slow" or "choke proud," they would quickly realize that he wasn't kidding after just one bite. Indeed, there were moments when the pork seemed questionable. A hint of green here, a dubious odor there. However, the slogan wasn't "Is it fresh?" at Saloons. More like, "Did the last man get killed? If not, you tried it." Salt pork was also adaptable. On lengthy trips it might be gnawed like jerky, fried on its own, slapped over biscuits, or chopped into beans. When the stew pot got too thin or the chickens fled off, saloon cooks leaned on it, and cowboys packed it like treasure. It wasn't stylish, and it wasn't healthy either. However, salt pork worked well in a world where you could have to travel 60 miles before your next hot dinner, and you were stronger as a result if you made it through it. Stew, steaming, faintly meaty, and very dubious, was the great culinary equalizer in the untamed West. Regardless of how dilapidated the kitchen was, it was the one dish that practically every saloon offered. Why? For whatever odds and ends the cook had laying about or couldn't legally explain, stew was the ideal cover story. A pot, a fire, and ambition made up the basic base. You added whatever hadn't yet wandered away after starting with water, and possibly some beans or potatoes. Beef? Yes. A rabbit? Of course. A squirrel? Yes. A rattlesnake? Throw it in if it was no longer biting. According to one traveler, he once discovered a boot thread in his bowl. He wasn't even angry. The most chewable portion was that. The grade of the meat varied greatly. The local butcher's tender bits of beef were used in some stews. They had meat, others, well, the type that you didn't inquire about. You just ate around the chewy parts and prayed if the cook appeared anxious and the number of dogs had just dropped. If there were vegetables, they were often cooked until they were completely gone. Carrots turned into smudged orange. The onions vanished entirely. The longest-lasting food was potatoes, which finally gave up. The outcome? A seething brown-grey slurry that, with enough salt, tasted better than you may have imagined and smelled much nicer than it appeared. They were a luxury. Spices. Whatever was on the cook's hands or knife gave most stew its kick. You were in a luxury place if you got black pepper. Congrats if you were able to obtain chili powder. They were going to forcefully empty your sinuses. But for the tired cowboy, stew was comfort food regardless of the mystery. It was filling, hot, and could be extended indefinitely with the addition of water. You could reheat a pot 3 times in a row until it took on the consistency and personality of old glue, or you could use it to feed a dozen guys. The stew was so good you didn't eat it. Because it was there, because it was warm, and because there was nothing else to eat in town except tobacco and regret, you ate it. Just keep in mind to never inquire about its contents. Ignorance wasn't just bliss in the Wild West, it was dinner. Almost every bar offered something bread-like to mop up the stew, but not every cowboy could afford a steak. Usually that something was either hardtack, which was essentially bread's zombie cousin, or soft, flaky biscuits that were divine when fresh. First, let's talk about the biscuits. When prepared well, which was uncommon but enchanted, they were flaky, buttery, and warm enough to make a guy think he had wandered into a real kitchen. Good biscuit-making cooks were legendary in the area. Some swore by buttermilk, while others said lard was their secret. Most likely, a few simply had low standards and fortuitous hands. To mop up any broth that hadn't burned your tongue, these biscuits were best eaten with stew or beans. They were frequently prepared in cast-iron skillets, baked over open flames, and, if the setting was upscale, served with a splash of molasses or a dubious-looking piece of butter. A slab of flour and water that was baked until it could withstand nuclear winter was known as hardtack. It was originally designed for sailors and soldiers, but one simple truth led it west. Nothing went wrong. It was hardly food anyway. It took strategy to eat hardtack. You would first check it for weevils, which were an extra crunch, but not a deal-breaker. After that, you would soak it in whiskey, coffee, or stew until it became tender. This might take 2 presidential terms or 10 minutes. Chewing hardtack required dedication even after soaking. You struggled with it rather than simply eating it. Cowboys who contested a piece and lost, most likely, made significant money for dentists. Here's the problem though. Hardtack and biscuits both have their uses. They were inexpensive, they were transportable, you were filled up by them. And that was sufficient in a world where calories were more important than food. So you counted your blessings when you walked into a dusty tavern and spotted a dish of hot cookies. Well, at least they had a tail if they gave you a palm-sized hardtack puck. A teeth chip, perhaps. Try cowboy coffee if you believe that contemporary coffee is too strong. A strong enough brew to make you stare back and dare to blink rather than just wake you up. In the Wild West, coffee was more about survival than flavor. It wasn't roasted at the source, filtered using expensive equipment, or decorated with foam art made from oat milk. Roughly or not at all, it was ground, then put into a kettle and cooked until the liquid became black and alive. This was the typical recipe. Use whatever water supply you have, preferably away from the horses. A handful of coffee grinds, measured by anger and instinct, should be added. Bring it to a boil, hard. Avoid straining it. Don't doubt it. Simply pour and hope. The outcome? A dark, viscous mixture that tasted of revenge and smelt of burnt dreams. Cowboys received both caffeine and fiber in one valiant slurp because it was not unusual for the final sip to have more grounds than liquid. Nevertheless, they adored it. On chilly desert mornings, coffee kept you warm. You were kept awake by night watches. It covered up hangovers and aided in the digestion of dubious stew. It was a tin cup that combined comfort, discipline, and fuel. Unless they had a kitchen, saloons didn't always serve coffee, but when they did, it was hot, likely old and powerful enough to remove paint. It's like drinking a mule's kick, but you miss it when it's gone, according to one rancher. If accessible, fancy people may have canned milk or extra sugar. The others simply scowled and pushed through. And you, would have the strongest brew in the world, thick as tar and twice as bitter, if a saloon had kept reheating the same pot all day. Notably, some cooks stretched the pot by reusing old grounds. This cost-cutting approach produced coffee that tasted like regret and disappointment, but it was still useful, because you didn't sip coffee for enjoyment in the Wild West. To feel alive and remain that way, you drank it. Meat was more than simply nourishment in the Wild West. It was money, prestige, and sometimes a show of courage. You may order a steak at a saloon if you could afford it. The outcome was solely determined by chance, time, and whether the cook harbored personal animosity toward you. Theoretically, steak was a luxury. As a matter of fact, it was frequently a rough, overdone slab of beef that had been fried in lard in a skillet, burnt into submission, and served with no garnish at all. The cook would simply look at you till your mustache wilted if you requested medium rare. Saloons used alternative options when fresh beef was unavailable, which, let's face it, wasn't very often. Salted buffalo, dried jerky, sometimes venison, or even wild boar, if someone had been lucky enough to catch one. By fortunate, we mean that we were able to strike it and pull it back before the buzzards did. Meat became more inventive in remote communities or mining towns. Roasted jackrabbit, rattlesnake, and squirrel stew with spice. It was fair game if it had legs and wasn't a customer's horse. There were occasions when you were offered meat and nobody identified it. That was an indication to eat in silence and refrain from inquiring. You simply sipped your whiskey, nodded solemnly, and accepted your destiny if you chewed for too long or discovered something that looked like whisker. And there was the age factor. Some foods had survived long enough to be given names. Cooks would tell you it was well aged after slicing out the poor pieces and covering the remainder with gravy. You were only entitled to one raised eyebrow if your plate twitched when you poked it. You might get a real supper, though, if the meat was fresh and the cook wasn't intoxicated. A fried egg on top, a sizzling chunk of meat, and sometimes a biscuit on the side. This plate served as a reminder of why people survived gunfights. You ate what was there and hoped it didn't eat you back most of the time. There was no such thing as dessert in a Wild West bar. It was more of a fortunate coincidence, the product of a cook with extra ingredients and a sweet comfort food. It was cornbread, prepared with plain cornmeal, fat, water, or milk, and perhaps, if the cook recalled, a pinch of baking powder. The frontier menu's Swiss Army knife was cornbread. If someone was lazy or in a hurry, they may sprinkle spoonfuls of it into boiling stew, bake it in pans, or fry it in skillets. When cornbread was served alone, it was nearly never fresh, since it was crumbly, dry, and, depending on who cooked it, slightly sugary. More frequently, you might receive a wedge that was as hard as a miner's conscience, having been sitting close to the furnace since dawn. However, this is where the magic took place. Molasses. It was a dark, syrupy, sticky wonder that transformed ordinary cornbread into something almost magnificent. The outlaws drizzling, the cowboys frosting, and the lone gambler's final glimmer of hope before losing everything due to a bad hand. Molasses covered over the floors in even the driest baked items was inexpensive and held up well in the heat. You were lucky if there was a barrel of it in a saloon. By frontier standards, you were essentially dining at a five-star restaurant if they warmed it before serving. Some chefs went one step farther and topped skillet-fried cornbread with molasses and a dash of spice or salt. It seemed like cake, even though you had been chewing hardtack and jerky all week. After a difficult ride or a near miss in the poker room, cornbread with molasses became the standard dessert since it was quick, inexpensive, satisfying, and sweet enough to soothe your nerves. There is only grit, grain, and gooey satisfaction, no frosting, whipped cream, or frills. And it was more than sufficient for many. Dessert didn't need to gleam when your life was filled with dust storms, cattle drives, and the occasional firefight. Simply put, It served as a reminder that not everything in the West was out to get you. You may have been offered eggs and chicken if you were fortunate enough to stumble into a bar before midday, ideally sober and not bleeding. If you were either in the middle of a miracle or a trap. First, let's talk about the eggs. In the Wild West, fresh eggs were extremely valuable. Not real gold, but almost as rare and almost as delicate. Raising chickens was not a pastime. They tended to wander, were grumpy, and were sometimes eaten, stolen, or lost to foxes. They either had their own chickens, a local source, or a covert smuggling operation from the next town over if a saloon had eggs on hand. They were what kind of eggs? I hope it's chicken, but it could also be duck or something else. You figured out how to avoid asking. You ordered eggs, and the age of the egg and the mood of the cook determined what you got. Some were cooked till the yolks turned to leather, while others were scrambled to cover up color. If it wobbled when it touched your plate, it was a sign from the universe to order whiskey instead. Although it wasn't served frequently, chicken was on the menu. A skinny bird that died enraged would most likely be what you would receive if it stated fried chicken. Some chickens weren't worth chewing, since they were tough, bony, and fried in lard until the flavor was gone. However, many ate it with gratitude because it was meat, hot, and not beans once more. You could end up with a quarter roasted over an open flame or a drumstick the size of your thumb. Part of the appeal was that you might also get a feather in your gravy. Saloons used breakfast servings of chicken and eggs as a status signal. We have food that didn't come from a barrel or a can, they said. You would tell your friends about it for weeks if the eggs were warm, and the chicken wasn't dry, and if you got food sickness, well, that was just the West reminding you who was in charge. Nevertheless, ordering eggs had an optimistic quality. They signified survival, they meant sadness, and perhaps they meant you would be alive enough to drink by dark. Pie was a statement rather than merely a dessert at a Wild West bar. You might tell this saloon was serious if you noticed a pie on the bar with a golden crust, steam rising, and the aroma of apples escaping through the booze and smoke. In a world of bean slop and overdone meat, you also knew that someone in the kitchen had worked hard, which was almost like a love letter. Don't get ahead of yourself, though. In the Wild West, pie was not a flawless pastry with a lattice top and fresh fruit straight from the farm. Typically served lukewarm, it was a rustic and rough affair with uneven crusts and fillings made from dried or canned fruit. Not unless you were followed into town by a cow, whipped cream. Apple, peach, and berry were the most popular types. Being a broad category, berries occasionally included raisins or items that only slightly resembled berries. There may be a hint of cinnamon if the cook had a sweet tooth. Otherwise, you have hope, sugar, and crust. Pie was a rare treat, though. Since leaving home, the majority of cowboys had not seen one, and saloons were aware that providing pie offered them a competitive advantage. Customers would come from 2 towns over for a good slice, and you can sure that someone would threaten to shoot over the last piece if the pie was warm and flaky. There are documented accounts of poker games that resulted in gunfights over disagreements over dessert, as well as some wildly inflated legends. Cheating at cards is as legitimate an offense as taking the last slice. Pie was almost sacred in a world where men had been stabbed over whiskey that had been spilled. Not all pies were made equal, of course. Some had contents that suggested they were fruit in a past life, while others were primarily crust. But the pie was something to remember if the following conditions were met. The oven was hot, the cook was sober, and the fruit wasn't rotting. A slice of pie was more than simply nourishment in the dust and grime of the frontier. It was hope presented on a tin plate. In the Wild West, playing cheese was similar to playing poker. It was risky, involved some bluffing, and you were likely to regret your decisions the following day. Yes, it was there. but only if you knew where to look and was brave enough to do so, because cheese was not transported on neat wax, paper-wrapped wheels. Local people manufactured it, frequently after reading about dairy fermentation while intoxicated. The majority of saloon cheese was either soft, crumbly, and a little bit pungent to the nostrils, or hard, yellow, and suspiciously sweaty. The ability to refrigerate was a luxury. Therefore, it's likely that your cheese had taken on a personality, unless it was a very cold month or the saloon was close to a cave. It could be a lump of dairy product with salt on top, cheddar, or something vaguely Swiss. You and your jaw were at odds if it creaked when you bit into it. Typically, bits of cheese were served with bread, jerky, or, if you were lucky, a pickle. It provided cowboys with a protein boost in between fights and helped counterbalance the saltiness of everything else. If the cook was feeling creative, you could even toast it on cornmeal or melt it over beans. But watch out, some saloons take shortcuts. Cheese could be curdled milk that has been pressed into a bar shape and covered with pepper to divert your attention, or it could be old butter gone bad. According to a traveling trader, he once purchased cheese in Nevada that had a rind and tasted like boiling socks. Even if the cheese was poor, it was still cheese, so he finished it. And a saloon that served any cheese at all was unusual in the Wild West. It indicated that the owner had access to a cow that hadn't been rustled yet, or at least ties to a nearby farm. In a location where the majority of people still wash in sand, offering cheese was a flex and a sign of modernity rather than just a taste. A slice of cheese on a saloon dish would therefore be eyed, sniffed, tapped with a fork, and then eaten nevertheless. For a gamble was simply a part of dining in the West. It was probably served in a Wild West saloon if it could be in vinegar and left in a jar. Pickling was a survival tactic as much as a taste preference. Saloon kitchens used brine and sourness to prevent food from slipping off the shelf prior to refrigeration: fruit, eggs, vegetables, and even meat. Nothing was immune to vinegar's ability to preserve food. And that's how everything got pickled for us. Cucumbers pickled, the traditional, sharp, crunchy, and sometimes green. They were offered as accompaniments, whiskey chases, or simply a snack in between poor choices. They were cooked fresh with spice and garlic if you were lucky. Otherwise, they tasted like raindrops and regret. Eggs pickled, a mainstay of the saloon. Behind the bar, generally close to the whiskey, you would see them floating in hazy jars. They had the texture of sorrow and resembled spectral eyes. They were sworn by some cowboys. They were easy to keep, provided a rapid protein boost, and remained down for the most part. They were cursed at by others. Onions pickled, typical in mining communities, strong enough to ward off unwelcome chatter. It's acidic and sharp. You could talk downwind of a stampede after just one mouthful. It may even include pickled pears or peaches. It wasn't dinner or dessert, but rather wet vinegary optimism when dried fruit was steeped in sweet brine to produce a dish that was both perplexing and oddly delicious. The shelf life of pickled foods was their greatest asset. Jars might be stored in a bar for months or even years without becoming bad. And that was priceless in a location where meat went bad faster than a hand of poker. But let's face it, not everything that was pickled was made equally. Sometimes the pickled object peered back at you, sometimes the cook experimented, and sometimes the jars weren't properly sealed. Some stories, perhaps over the top, describe men biting into pickled sausages and discovering bones, or just the word pork on the label. Still, the Wild West experience included pickled foods. Like everything else that lingered out there, it was sour, salty, and somehow delicious. You ate them because they wouldn't kill you, not because you were enjoying them, most likely. Cowboys and drifters alike resorted to whiskey, the most reliable item on the bar menu. When food was in short supply, the kitchen was closed, or the stew appeared to be still alive. It was always accessible. No preparation was necessary. Additionally, you forget that you're hungry or that you've just consumed a bowl of squirrel mystery meat if you consume enough of it. In the Wild West, whiskey wasn't selected by experts or aged in oak barrels. It was raw, abrasive, and frequently harmful. Made in bathtubs, barns, and backrooms, it was distilled from corn, rye, or whatever the barkeep had lying around. The end product was a drink that could be used to treat wounds, remove paint, and incite a brawl. Some called it chain lightning, some called it rotgut, and some just called it lunch. Men drank their calories, one searing shot at a time, when bread was mouldy and beans were burned. Saloon whiskey served as a survival tool in addition to being a beverage. It eased the agony of fractured ribs, heartache, trail dust, and exceedingly dubious stew. One shot prior to a duel, 2 shots following, and possibly 3 more as you awaited the outcome of your bullet wound. Saloons would often serve whiskey specials with a side of beans or biscuits, not for taste, but to keep you standing. In some ways, the pickled egg floating in whiskey that some men requested served as both protein and hydration. Whiskey, of course, was a social glue. You bought it to create arguments, to make friends, and perhaps to say you're sorry afterward. How quickly a saloon's whiskey knocked a man off his stool was a good indicator of its repute. Goodness, don't inquire. Some whiskey was hardly more than moonshine with colour. Cayenne pepper and tobacco juice were among the additives. If it didn't burn as it went down, you were most likely consuming kerosene. Nevertheless, nobody voiced any complaints because whiskey was the only item on the menu that was always honest about its nature, warm and inexpensive. And you hoisted it high and called it dinner on the nights when your food arrived in a glass without a fork or any sense of judgment. Every Wild West saloon that dared to serve meals had a dark, smoke-covered figure whose influence was equal to that of the town preacher, the sheriff, and the bartender put together. The chef. Either a culinary war criminal or a life-saving genius, this person was frequently unshaven and constantly agitated. There was no compromise. You would remember their cuisine for days, either out of gratitude or stomach trauma, but you would never see them grin. Saloon cooks lacked culinary training. They were mostly ex-miners, ex-con artists, or ex-somethings who were not scared of dubious meat and knew how to build a fire. Their kitchen. One cast-iron skillet that hadn't been cleaned since the gold rush, a dented stove, and a fire pit. Nevertheless, they managed to feed whole saloons. They would make a pot of chili that would make a guy cry on a good day. Positively. The cornbread would be just sweet enough to bring back memories of home, the biscuits would be warm, and the beans would be cooked through. On a bad day, however, the meat was grey, the beans were burned, and the stew had an eerie, oily coating that shifted when the pot was motionless. You didn't voice any complaints, you couldn't. There was obvious saloon etiquette. Don't make fun of the cook, because everything was within the cook's control. The secret meat ratio, the fat and the salt. The freshest cut went to you if they liked you. Otherwise you received the leftover spoon scrapings from the catastrophe last night, which were warmed into chilly surprise. They also served as the informal bouncer for the saloon. A ladle that had just survived cooking salt pork was not someone anyone wanted to hit. Additionally, they could clear a room more quickly than a shotgun if the cook carried a cleaver, which many did. These cooks were essential no matter how they felt. They prevented travelers from collapsing in the middle of a sentence, miners from fainting, and cowboys from standing. They lived by one rule, worked long hours in the heat and smoke, and took insults as spice. The door is there if you don't like it, or the whiskey. Therefore you always gave the cook a respectful nod, regardless of whether they were your savior or your saboteur, because in the Wild West it was their filthy, gorgeous hands that held your fate and your stomach. The true question still stands after we've entered through the swinging doors, smelled the stew, and gazed down at a pickled egg in a hazy jar. In reality, would you consume the fare offered at a saloon in the Wild West? Modern taste senses may not be able to withstand the encounter, let's face it. The stew was more mystery than food, the beef was a chance, and the beans were simple. Strong teeth, a larger stomach, and the kind of hunger that comes with riding a scorched horse for 40 miles while breathing only dust are all you'd need. Here's the problem, though. For the American frontier's misfits, miners, gamblers, and cowboys, saloon cuisine wasn't about fancy flavors or visually appealing plating. It had to do with fuel, calories, warmth, a warm dish in between train robberies, gunfights, or another night spent sleeping beside a mule named Regret in a barn. It was a matter of survival. You didn't object when the biscuit crumbled like chalk or inquire about the source of the meat. You just sat down, consumed the food that was served to you, and then rinsed it off with a substance that would either kill the bacteria or at least make you stop thinking about it. When was the food good? The cook had saved some molasses for the cornbread, and the coffee didn't sting when the beans were fresh. It seemed miraculous. Would you eat it then, if you were alive at the time? Indeed. You would be grateful for it rather than merely eating it. You would use coins that still smelled like horse sweat and explosives to order seconds, scrape the bowl, and clean the dish with your bread crust. You would toast with whiskey, laugh with strangers, curse the cook, and perhaps, just possibly, finish the evening with a piece of pie and a tale worth sharing, because it wasn't glamorous to eat in a saloon. It was oily, gritty, and authentic. And that was sufficient in a world where the West remained untamed. Tattoos were something far older, engraved with mystery, significance, and survival in mind rather than fashion, long before they were scribbled on biceps and backs in hip stores with buzzing needles. Let's travel back in time to a period before cities, before gods had been named, and when people lived in intimate proximity to their bones, both physically and spiritually. Otzi the Iceman comes on stage. His mummified remains, found frozen in a glacier between Austria and Italy in 1991, was more than 5,000 years old, older than Stonehenge and the pyramids. Nevertheless, scientists discovered something remarkably contemporary on his leathery skin: ink. In fact, there were 61 of them. They were neither stylized animals nor decorative spirals. They were lines and specks of dark carbon that ran around his ankles, behind his knees and down his spine. This is when things get crazy. Otzi's tattoos were placed at established acupuncture places. Was this an ancient healing method, a crude method of managing pain, or something more spiritual, a physical manifestation of a rite of endurance? We will never be able to be sure. However, one thing is evident. Humans started purposefully tattooing their bodies as early as the Stone Age. Otzi wasn't by himself either. The majority of tattoos in ancient Egypt were applied on women, such as dancers and priestesses. These were symbolic designs that were frequently applied on the chest, thighs, and belly, rather than ornamental butterflies or the names of former loves. Some academics think that these tattoos, which resemble spiritual armor painted directly onto the body, were meant to channel fertility, protect during childbirth, or fight off evil spirits. Archaeologists have even discovered mummies with animal tattoos on their limbs in Nubia, which is south of Egypt. Crocodiles and bulls are representations of strength and endurance. In these prehistoric communities, getting a tattoo wasn't a sign of disobedience. They were ritualistic, resolute, and reverent behaviors. They conveyed meaning by pain, permanency, and belief rather than just ink. The next time you see someone wearing an ink sleeve at the gym or on the metro, keep in mind that they are continuing a practice that began in the cold, the sand and the holy silence of long-forgotten millennia, not in a studio. Say that to a Polynesian chief, and you'll see the audience fall silent if you ever believed that tattoos were only rebellious or edgy accessories. Tattoos were not considered optional or ornamental in Polynesian societies. They were revered. Actually, the Tahitian term tatau, which means to strike, is where the word tattoo originates. It started just like that, with soot-dipped bone instruments being rhythmically tapped into the skin with a stick, each blow resonating with years of custom. Not only were tattoos a form of art in locations like Samoa and Tonga, but they were also a symbol of identification for the Maori people of New Zealand. The Maori people's elaborate facial tattoos, known as moko, might reveal all the information you required: their position, their relatives, their heritage, and even their individual accomplishments. Removing the face would be like wiping out a man's entire existence, since it was more than simply a canvas, it was a living resume. During harsh ritual rites of passage, young males would frequently get their first tattoos. This was a spiritual awakening, not a decision made on a Friday night after drinking. No anesthetics or numbing creams were used during the agonizing procedure. Instead, there was only unadulterated bravery and a shared conviction in the pain's greater meaning. Symbols of beauty, maturity, and mana, the sacred power said to permeate all living things, were also tattooed on women, frequently on the thighs, chin, or lips. In a society filled of stories, a woman without tattoos can be seen as lacking something, like a blank canvas. However, colonialism attempted to eradicate it all, as it frequently does. Missionaries brought shame, soap, and scissors. They viewed the tattoos as unchristian, heathen, and archaic. Traditional tattooing was illegal in some places, which pushed it underground like a secret language, but the ink held up. Many Polynesians now are proudly reclaiming their tattooing history. You can hear the voice of tatau once again across the Pacific, not just as an art form, but also as a cultural survival tactic, thanks to the reappearance of the ancient tools and the resurgence of the designs. These weren't only skin markings. Declarations of spirit, blood, and belonging were and remain. It may surprise you to discover tattoos when you enter the world of togas, gladiators, and philosophers. After all, we typically picture marble statues and immaculate, idealized figures when we think of ancient Greece and Rome. However, if you dispel the belief, ink will be revealed hiding in the shadows. Tattoos were first connected to slaves and criminals in ancient Greece. Indeed, the Greek word stigma, which is the origin of our current word stigmatize, described the permanent marks that were inked or branded as a form of punishment on a person's flesh. These were neither ornamental nor symbolic. They were cautions, labels. If you were a court adversary or a fugitive slave, your captor may permanently ink a scarlet letter on your forehead that reads, "Stop me, I ran away." This concept was copied and expanded upon by the Romans, who were always practical. As a sort of flesh-bound dog tag, soldiers in the Roman army, particularly those in specialized legions, were frequently tattooed to show their devotion. However, they also branded slaves, POWs, and gladiators with tattoos. It was about possession rather than identity. This has a darker twist. As a kind of humiliation, early Christians who were persecuted by Roman authorities were occasionally given tattoos. However, the practice would be reclaimed by Christians decades later. During the Middle Ages, pilgrims to Jerusalem frequently returned with tiny crosses inked on their arms as a symbol of their suffering and dedication. What started out as a form of discipline evolved into a symbol of faith. It's interesting to note that Emperor Constantine, who also made Christianity legal, outlawed facial tattooing in later Roman periods. He said that the face should not be defiled because it was created in the likeness of God, not because it was cruel. The irony, still bodies were up for grabs. In the Greco-Roman culture, tattoos frequently devalued a person's social status, in contrast to Polynesia, where they raised it. You were labeled a slave, a sinner, and an outsider by your tattoos. However, they also told a tale that you held with you forever, even if it wasn't necessarily one you wanted to hear. The purpose of tattoos in these civilizations of law, conquest, and spectacle was not self-expression. They served as means of power, punishment, and control, sometimes literally. They would eventually be recovered, just like all other symbols of oppression. The East adopted a more spiritual, symbolic approach to body art, where tattoos might serve as both social conundrum and religious protection, in contrast to the West, which branded its slaves and criminals. We should start with India. India has a long history of permanent tattoos, even though it is best known for Mendi, the temporary henna art used at festivals and weddings. Tribal groups such as the Bega, Gondi, and Santhal regarded tattoos as both protective and decorative. In a deeply ingrained custom that has been passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, a woman may have tattoos signifying religious commitment, strength, or fertility. Beauty wasn't the only reason for these tattoos. They were regarded as soul jewelry that could not be taken by thieves or taken away by poverty. In Japan, however, the situation was more nuanced. Tattoos may have had a religious purpose in the early Jomon period, maybe serving as a status symbol or a means of warding off evil spirits. However, tattooing took on a completely new life by the time Japan entered its more regulated ages, especially during the Edo period. It started off as punishment. Criminals were forever branded as untrustworthy by having marks signifying their crime and locality permanently inked on their faces or arms. Imagine entering a village where everyone can read your skin and instantly know your misdeeds. Then an interesting thing occurred. There was a counterculture. Workers, firefighters, and eventually Yakuza members were among the outcasts who took up tattoos as a mark of honor rather than disgrace. They produced intricate full-body patterns known as irizumi, which frequently included mythological characters, dragons, and tigers. Carved into the body over hundreds of agonizing hours, these were works of art. Every artwork conveyed a tale, an individual legend inscribed beneath the scrutiny of society. In Southeast Asia, Buddhist pilgrims created Sakyan tattoos, geometric patterns, and Pali texts that were thought to provide spiritual blessings, power, and protection at the same time. Monks used steel or bamboo rods that had been sharpened to administer these, and prayer and chanting were always included. In the East, tattoos may be considered criminal or sacred, taboo or holy. Who wore them and why determined everything. However, one thing was for sure. Skin was never quiet in these societies. It discussed pride, prayer, retribution, and authority. Once a sign of identity or punishment, the tattoo needle started to disappear from the Western world as the Roman Empire gave way to the advent of Christianity. Why? Because the body was no longer just flesh in the perspective of the church. It was a temple. Furthermore, it seems that temples were not intended for graffiti. The early Christians' attitudes against tattoos were nuanced. On the one hand, certain communities accepted tattoos as religious symbols. As a permanent spiritual passport, pilgrims would have tiny crosses permanently inked on their wrists to symbolize their dedication before departing for Jerusalem. These served as markers of their tenacity and survival, evidence that they had completed the holy pilgrimage and survived to share their story. However, that was the exception rather than the rule. The prevailing message from religious leaders was evident by the early Middle Ages. Pagan meant sinful, and marking the body was a pagan habit. The Bible was frequently quoted, particularly Leviticus 19:28. You are not allowed to tattoo any marks on yourself or create any cuts in your flesh for the deceased. The Lord is me. In much of medieval Europe, that one line was sufficient to bury an entire art style. During the Inquisition, tattoos came to be associated with heresy, witchcraft, and heathenism, things you did not want to have attached to your name. Tattooing was relegated to rumors and superstition in monasteries and Christian nations, where it all but vanished. However, the ink never really dried, even during this period of repression. Religious tattooing, or tiny crosses inked on hands and arms, was still practiced by some Christian sects in the furthest regions of the Byzantine Empire. This practice was frequently done to guard against Islamic enslavement. Coptic Christians in Ethiopia also kept up tattoo customs, using holy symbols to brand young believers as part of religious rites. Additionally, tattoos quietly returned among the Crusaders, the knights who marched to the Holy Land. In addition to providing spiritual protection, some people engraved little crosses on their bodies so that in the event of a battle death, they may be buried as Christians, demonstrating their religion even in death. Therefore, the medieval West made an unsuccessful attempt to eradicate tattooing. Like a buried relic, the ink patiently waited for its moment to rise anew while hiding in monasteries, pilgrimage routes, and desert churches. Tattoos discovered a new medium as the age of discovery ushered in and wooden ships started cutting across uncharted seas. Sailors. Nor were they indigenous shamans or artists from the royal court. These men were tough, grizzled by salt and superstition, and they started adorning their bodies with crucifixes, mermaids, and anchors. However, how did tattoos make their way back to Europe after being banned for centuries? Enter Captain James Cook's expeditions from the 18th century. His troops found entire societies inked when they landed in Polynesia. Many sailors, intrigued and in awe, got themselves tattooed to honor the cultures they came across, and let's face it, to demonstrate that they had visited a far-flung place. Not only was it stylish to return to port with tattoos, it served as a sort of CV, a living log of your voyages and the things you managed to survive. Soon, the seafaring class adopted tattoos as their unofficial uniform. However, style wasn't the only factor. It had a strong superstitious bent. A forearm anchor represented steadiness. Since pigs and roosters were housed in wooden crates that floated after shipwrecks, it was thought that having them tattooed on the feet would keep them from drowning. In the hopes that it would provide them with the grip they needed to endure choppy seas and tangled ropes, some sailors even got the phrase "hold fast" permanently inked across their knuckles. Then there were the religious images, the Virgin Mary above the heart, and crosses on the back. When the sea turned against them, sailors thought these tattoos provided an additional layer of spiritual armor and heavenly protection. Not among the nobles, but among the periphery, tattoos proliferated as these tattooed sailors returned to ports in Europe and America. Convicts, soldiers, and dock laborers, the brave, the drifters, and the lower classes now spoke tattoos. They were meaningful, though. In the US, soldiers from the Civil War started getting their names and regiments inked on their forearm as a somber precaution against dying in combat and needing to be identified. It was a tiny, agonizing insurance policy in a world without dog tags. Therefore, the individuals who charted the world proudly sported tattoos, whereas rulers and clergy avoided them. Every mark was a prayer, a charm, a hurt, or a story to them, and it might be the last thing that remained that bore your name when the world perished in waves or cannon fire. Tattoos had moved away from temples and tribal ceremonies during the 19th and 20th centuries. They have turned into symbols of defiance in many places of the world, particularly in prison. Through the use of improvised ink, razors, and needles, tattoos were given a new, gritty, coded language by prisons. We should begin with Russia. Inside the gulags, a covert tattoo society thrived under the Soviet Union's imposing shadow. They weren't ornamental. They were brutally hierarchical, symbolic, and biographical. On the shoulders, a star. You were respected as a result. Around the neck, barbed wire. You never left. You were a lifer. On your breast, a cathedral with domes. A sentence served was symbolized by each dome. Your disobedience, rank, and misdeeds were all revealed by the tattoos. However, you might find it hacked off with a knife if you disobey the code or wear a symbol you did none acquire. Once a method of punishment, Irizumi was made a badge of honor by the Yakuza in Japan, usually concealed under professional suits, full-body outfits depicting samurai warriors, dragons, and koi fish covered flesh from shoulder to ankle. Getting inked was more than simply a rebellious gesture. It was a loyalty rite, costly, painful, and irreversible. Prison tattoos had their own connotations in the West. A teardrop under your eye could indicate that you have killed someone or, in certain situations, lost a loved one in American prisons. Long words, dots on the knuckles, numbers, and acronyms might all be represented by cobwebs on the elbows. Complete identities were rewritten in ink, making them invisible to guards but obvious to anyone who knew the language. Pens melted into ink, paper clips, and illegal sewing needles were frequently used to create these tattoos. This was a place of grief and meaning, not glamour. For many prisoners, it was more about identity, a sign that you belonged, or a warning that you didn't, than it was about art. These tattoos were highly stigmatized outside of prison walls. You were tagged as deadly, untouchable, and unredeemable. However, in a system designed to rob them of everything else, the ink was frequently the only thing that the men and women who wore them had in common, the only aspect of themselves that they possessed. In prison, tattoos were survival, not style. By the 20th century, tattoos had evolved from being outlawed and used as sacred symbols to becoming a popular form of defiance. Tattoos were previously viewed by the church as sinful, but in contemporary culture they have come to represent freedom and, on occasion, a certain brand of cool. You could still see tattooed performers in circus sideshows in the early 1900s, as well as illustrated men and women who charged admission to display their completely inked bodies. People stared and gasped. Around the middle of the century, something started to change, but it was still taboo, shrouded in spectacle. Simple tattoos, anchors, eagles, and hearts with their mother's name inscribed on them were among the personal symbols of suffering, survival, or patriotism that soldiers brought back from World War II. These tattoos, which were etched into their skin as mementos of the things they had witnessed and the brothers they had lost, weren't merely for show. The counterculture followed. In the 1960s and 1970s, tattoos started to leave their blue-collar origins and appear on the bodies of beat poets, rock singers, and bikers. A bracelet was permanently inked on Janis Joplin's wrist. As a mark of honor, the Hells Angels wore ink. Even while it's still somewhat taboo in polite society, getting a tattoo has evolved into a rebellious gesture that expresses one's disregard for others' opinions. And parlors for tattoos? They were no longer secret hideouts in shady back streets. They became legitimate. The needle was transformed into a brush by artists such as Lyle Tuttle, who is renowned for inking Cher in the Rolling Stones. All of a sudden, tattoos were more than just symbols. They were powerful, political, and personal statements. However, the stigma didn't go away right away. Visible tattoos were still a barrier to employment throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. Numerous job applications were printed without any visible tattoos. Particularly for women whose bodies were more heavily policed, ink continued to be a hint of criminality, transgression, or recklessness. Nevertheless, things were changing. Celebrities adopted full sleeves, tattoo conventions sprung up everywhere, and tattoo TV shows appeared. The art form was now considered culture rather than a subculture. Finally making a comeback to the public, tattoos have gone from rebellion to the runway. However, they never lost sight of their origins. You would assume that something as archaic as a tattoo may be left behind in a world where everything, including our voices and memories, is stored in the cloud. Rather, tattoos are experiencing a resurgence. adapting to the digital age rather than merely enduring it. Tattoos are more than just ink and skin these days. They are equipped with machines that would make sailors in the 19th century cry, are powered by applications, and are enhanced by technology. AI is now being used by certain artists to create extremely detailed designs. Others operate devices that print ink with extreme accuracy. Additionally, smart tattoos are becoming more popular. Sense or embedded experimental patches that can monitor vital signs, operate gadgets, or even light up with LED ink. Science fiction isn't it. Labs are already testing it. However, tattoos are still very popular without the technology. Across cultures, genders, and professions, what was previously prohibited is now cherished. Physicians are quite active. Instructors wear ink wristbands. CEOs with ornate back parts concealed under their suits enter boardrooms. The art genre is now more accessible because to social media. In Seattle, a tattoo from Seoul might become very popular. With just a phone call, clients can schedule a session, and artists can quickly amass audiences throughout the world. However, the significance of tattoos has not diminished. It has, if anything, become more intimate. In order to remember, to heal, and to feel like they belong, people now permanently ink quotes in lost languages, constellations from the night of their child's birth, pet images, the coordinates of where they met their spouses, and sound waves of loved ones' voices. There is also a resurgence of cultural tattooing. Andean indigenous people are using skin to recover their identity and revive ancestral designs. A living act of remembering what was once suppressed is now openly worn. There are still arguments, of course. Is it a trend or art? Is it sacred or shallow? If your tale is filtered by likes and algorithms, can you really own it? Perhaps that's the point, though. In the liminal space between suffering and beauty, permanence and change, tattoos have always existed. They are both futuristic and primordial, a declaration for the future and a whisper from the past. Additionally, tattoos will persist as long as people are drawn to memory, meaning, and creating marks. Ink always speaks beneath the surface, even when words are unable to. Tamiris was merely a daughter of the wind, born to the untamed vast steppe, before empires fought and blood drenched the sand, before rulers shuddered at her name. Her homeland wasn't resonating with philosophy or adorned with marble. It was wide, free, and merciless. This was the Massagette's world. Their lives were molded by conflict, honor, and survival, and they were fierce nomadic horse archers who rode like plains spirits. Although we don't know much about Tamiris's early years, we can picture their cadence. Before she could run, she would have learned to ride, and before she could speak in whole phrases, she would have learned to shoot. Girls were neither cloaked by silence nor imprisoned in tents among the Massagette. They grew up with iron in their blood, rode alongside the warriors and trained alongside the youths. One has to bleed to lead, and Tamiris bled for her people, even as a young woman. Her tribe lived off their herds, revered the sun and the sky, and buried their dead with weapons so they would be prepared for fight in the hereafter. They were proud, yet they lacked cities and golden temples, and they used arrows rather than prayers to confront their adversaries when they came near. Tamiris may have been the tribe's first leader, although she most likely assumed authority when her spouse passed away. What is certain, though, is that she did not inherit leadership when the time came. She grabbed it. Tamiris led an army during a period when the majority of women were viewed as property. She bargained with monarchs. As an equal, she dared to speak. She also forced them to listen if they didn't. She was not just a monarch. She was Shahmat, the checkmate of the steppe, a leather and bronze war chief who would soon have to contend with the world's biggest empire. However, power never comes without consequences, particularly for women. Whispers increased in volume as Tamiris established her power. A king stood guard over the mountains to the south. Cyrus the Great was his name, and he desired more. The scene was prepared. The wind in the steppes howled. Tamiris, a warrior's daughter, will soon become a legend. Far to the south, a different form of power, one that was organized, imperial, and unrelenting, was emerging, while Tamiris ruled over the wide steppes. The Achaemenid Empire's founder, Cyrus the Great, had already subjugated Babylon in the south and Lydia in the west. Languages changed every few days as his flag soared over towns, mountains, and deserts. Cyrus wasn't finished, though. He built empires, and all builders eventually looked to the future. The Massaget were an opportunity disguised as a threat to Cyrus. They possessed the northeastern frontier, which gave them access to important territories, resources, and trading routes, but they lacked cities and gold. More significantly, the Massaget possessed pride, which no power could afford to overlook. Furthermore, Cyrus believed that pride may be distorted or shattered. However, Cyrus was also aware that sometimes the wisest course of action wasn't to use force. He was known for his shrewdness, tact, and cunning deception. He thus chose a new strategy, one that has been employed by kings before him to deal with dangers without spilling a single drop of blood. He made a marriage proposal. Cyrus dispatched envoys to Timaeus, proposing an alliance by marriage, according to ancient sources, most notably Herodotus. The powerful king of Persia and the warrior queen of the Massaget were a regal match on paper. Timaeus, however, was not a fool. She saw the proposition for what it was, a premeditated attempt to take her people without resistance, not an offer of love or a partnership. The fact that she refused was not well received in Persepolis's corridors. Cyrus switched to his favorite language, war, after the diplomatic games were ended. He gave the command for his army to cross the Araxes River, which was the natural border between the Massagetae and Persia. What Timaeus refused to give, he was going to take. However, Timaeus was already getting ready. She was familiar with the area. She was aware that her people battled fiercely and quickly while mounted. Above all, she was aware that Cyrus was not merely seeking territory. A woman who ventured to say no would be crushed by him. Although the most powerful king in the world had declared war, he was unaware of the level of rage he had just sparked on the steppe. The seasoned conqueror and great thinker Cyrus the Great thought he could outsmart Timaeus. He had defeated nations, destroyed towns, and battled kings. He saw the Massaget as nothing more than untamed nomads without cities to protect and swift horses. He was unaware that he was crossing the path of someone a lot more enraged and equally crafty. He had been cautioned by Timaeus. She conveyed a strong message after turning down his proposal of marriage. You will regret crossing the Araxes River. Nevertheless, Cyrus built a bridge of boats to transport his army into Massaget land and passed anyhow. Rather than attack right away, Timaeus withdrew her army, enticing Cyrus farther into uncharted territory. An abandoned camp that was well stocked with food and, more crucially, wine, a luxury that the nomadic Massaget never enjoyed, was discovered by the Persians. Cyrus may have believed the enemies had panicked and run away when he fell for the baited trap. He placed some of his troops under the leadership of a reliable officer, General Harpagus, inside the camp. They fell on the inebriated and unprepared Persians with lethal accuracy as the Massaget reappeared in the darkness. It was a quick and vicious struggle. Spargapises, a Massaget captain, and Timaeus's son, was among the dead. Reports on what transpired next vary. Some claim that after being captured alive, Spargapises asked to die and committed suicide. Everyone agrees, yet some say he was slain in the conflict. Something inside Timaeus cracked and then transformed to steel when she heard the news. Her anger became legendary, but her sadness was volcanic. She messaged Cyrus once more. "This one was a commitment, not a warning," she remarked. "I promise I will give you your fill, even though you may be a glutton for blood." She vowed that her retaliation would not be peaceful and that the ground would be covered in Persian blood. Cyrus had invaded her territory and abducted her son. He would now see the mother of a warrior who had been killed, the last face he would ever see, rather than the queen of the Massageti. The next conflict would be an execution rather than a fight. Like a sharp, blinding blade, the sun rose across the fields. As the leader of her army, Timaeus was more than just a queen. She was a storm personified. The nomadic lifestyle had hardened her warriors, who painted their faces with anger and ash. This was about blood, not politics anymore. Despite his strength, Cyrus had misjudged the Massaget. He thought they would battle like the tribes he had previously subdued, chaotic, ill-coordinated, and easily defeated. However, Timaeus had been surrounded by fighters her entire childhood. She knew how to hit, not carelessly, but precisely. This time, she was not holding back as she mobilized her men for a full-scale attack on the Persian invaders. Due to the steppes' immense size, the site of the last fight has been lost to history. However, it is evident that Timaeus mounted a fierce counter-offensive. Like a wave of blades, her cavalry surged across the plains. They battled like people who had nothing left to lose, closing in with axes and firing arrows from horseback. The disciplined, seasoned, and battle-hardened Persians weren't prepared for this degree of coordinated rage. Timaeus fought alongside her soldiers rather than merely leading them. Her warriors were stoked like wildfire by her presence on the battlefield. Vengeance was the motivation behind every strike. Each allegation was a response to the death of her son. Despite Cyrus's best efforts, the line broke. They crushed the Persians. Where they stood, many perished. Others were pursued after running away into the boundless meadows. And amid the confusion fell Cyrus the Great, the man who had subjugated Lydia, Babylon, and almost the entire known world. Depending on the story, he may have been killed in battle or taken prisoner and put to death. In any case, he passed away according to Timaeus's wishes. What followed is notorious. Herodotus claims that Timaeus discovered Cyrus's body on the battlefield, had his head cut off, and then, as a last symbolic act of retaliation, immersed it in a wineskin containing human blood. "Drink all the blood you thirsted for," she said. Was it lyrical exaggeration or historical fact? Perhaps both. It didn't matter, though. It was an enduring message. The goal was to defeat Timaeus. Timaeus emerged triumphant when the dust settled and the grass soaked deeply in the blood of the empire. A warrior queen who had accomplished what no previous army or king had. She was responsible for Cyrus the Great's demise. The ancient world was rocked by the news of the defeat. A woman from the steppes had degraded the once powerful Achaemenid Empire, which was believed to be unstoppable. Although the Persians made every effort to minimize the loss, their founder's passing was unavoidable. Eventually, Cyrus's body was given back and respectfully interred in the royal mausoleum at Pasar Gardai. However, the legacy of the empire would bear the scar of his ultimate loss like a wound. But the triumph meant more to Timaeus and the Massagetæ than retaliation. It was a proclamation. They had defended their sovereignty with honor as well as with guns. Timaeus had not only survived but had succeeded after defying the most powerful ruler in the planet. She thereafter disappeared from the annals of history. There are no surviving documents that describe her final years, death, or any accomplishments she might have had. It seems as though Timaeus just rode back into the horizon and let the wind continue her narrative after exacting her revenge. She became a symbol as much as a woman, as historians, poets, and chroniclers attempted to fill in the gaps in the centuries that followed. Her name served as a stinging reminder to the Persians. She was seen by the Greeks as a contradiction, a barbarian who exhibited more dignity than many monarchs. Timaeus, a spectral queen who rides through the steppe with a sword that remembers, is a legendary figure to the peoples of Central Asia. Her legacy would serve as the basis for innumerable cultural representations. She was shown wearing royal armor in medieval books. She was depicted as towering over Cyrus's corpse in Renaissance paintings. Whether she was a mother avenger, a wild queen, a lesson in hubris, or a symbol of feminine power, she became what people needed in every age. One fact, however, breaks through the myth. History was altered by her. There was no throne passed down to Timaeus. In rage and fire she fashioned it. The Steppe Queen also demonstrated that not all empires succeed for a single, memorable moment. Those who ride with wrath in their hearts may fall to the hoops of warriors. Our knowledge of Timaeus is mostly derived from documents of the local Massagetae. They left behind nothing but the writings of Herodotus, a Greek who is frequently referred to as the father of history, and no stone tablets or royal archives. He immortalized Timaeus in his chronicles, writing a century after her time, portraying her as a warrior queen with incredible fortitude and fearsome retribution. Herodotus, however, was doing more than just recounting facts. His narrative was a combination of a morality tale and a history. Timaeus symbolized the ultimate reversal of imperial arrogance for him and his audience. Instead of being overthrown by a large army or a competing monarch, Cyrus the Great was overthrown by a lady who battled for her child rather than for fame. Herodotus presented her victory as if it were nearly mythic. He even described her gruesome retaliation, the bloody wineskin, Cyrus's severed head, and her damning words, "Drink your fill." Was it true, though? Historians today argue this point incessantly. Herodotus used Timaeus as a narrative device to denigrate the Persian Empire, which at the time of his writing was still a powerful force over the Greek world. However, others contend that Herodotus embellished or even made up sections of the story. Others think that although the blood wineskin incident may have been symbolic, Cyrus's death at Timaeus's hands most likely actually occurred. The issue of bias is another. Despite his wisdom, Herodotus frequently viewed other cultures through a Greek prism. He presented the Massagetae as untamed and unbridled, yet honorable, an exotic reflection of Greek principles of freedom and honor. In that context, Timaeus was more than just a savage. She served as a moral check on Persian aspirations. Nevertheless, Herodotus accomplished one goal despite the fact that specifics became hazy over time. He made sure Timaeus would live on. She became more than a historical footnote because of him. She stepped into the world of legend, where impact sharpens but facts soften. And Timaeus's story discovered an odd kind of longevity in that liminal area between myth and memory. Herodotus left us with a queen who refused to kneel and left her adversaries bleeding in the sand in a world ruled by kings and conquerors. Timaeus never held an empire of her own, despite having killed one of the most famous monarchs in antiquity. She did not write decrees on golden tablets or construct cities of stone. The Massagetae, her people, were nomads who lived by the rhythms of the earth, the sky, and the horse rather than by walls. As a result, Timaeus's legacy was never formalized. Her face was absent from royal coinage and marble busts, and her decrees were not preserved in archives. Rather, through firelight, singing, and the hushed awe of warriors, her story was transmitted as stories are on the steppe. The Central Asian steppes were home to numerous strong tribes, including the Massagetae. Expert horse archers who roamed the regions between the Caspian Sea and the boundaries of ancient China were their cousins, the Saka, the Dahai, and the Scythians. Because of their mobility, unpredictable nature, and fierce fighting style, these tribes were feared by empires. Although she was a female leader, Timaeus was not the only one. Women had significantly more independence in steppe culture than in many sedentary cultures. Women led, hunted, rode, and fought. Archaeologists have discovered the tombs of female fighters among the Scythians, buried with armor, weapons, and horse gear, proving that the legends of strong steppe queens were real. The apex of such tradition was Timaeus. Neither religion nor inheritance gave her power. It came from raw ability, grit, and respect. In an environment where surviving required riding faster, shooting better, and having no fear, she served as a political leader, a military commander, and a unifying force among disparate tribes. However, Timaeus became a sort of phantom queen because the Massagete left no monuments, and her name only reverberated in the steppes' oral traditions and strangers' writings. She was a warning to the Persian scribes, a marvel to the Greeks, and perhaps a memory passed down via bloodlines and battle songs to her people, a ghost that accompanied them on their rides across the plains. Even while empires come and go in stone, the tales of the steppe endure, and Timaeus, ferocious, heartbroken, and unwavering, became its voice. The empires that formerly encircled the Massagete rose and fell over the course of centuries. After battling Alexander the Great and constructing Persepolis, Cyrus's successors vanished into the dusty annals of history. However, Timaeus, her reputation lived on in the hearts of people who refused to submit, not in the palaces of monarchs. She evolved into more than just a monarch throughout Central Asia. She came to represent resistance, female strength, and the wild spirit of the steppe. In many respects, Timaeus represented a resistance that was not limited by location. Her narrative did not belong to any empire because she was neither Roman, Greek, or Persian. She was both deadly and inspirational as a result. Her name, distorted by language but never completely lost, was infrequently referenced by chroniclers in the Islamic world of the Middle Ages. She received plaudits for her justice and retribution in certain stories. Others viewed her as a barbaric queen, a reminder that a woman's authority could be both magnificent and scary. By the time the Renaissance arrived, Herodotus's books had rediscovered her story to European artists. She was shown by painters as triumphantly standing over Cyrus's lifeless body while wearing ornate armor. In one dramatic artwork, she triumphantly lifts his severed head in the air like a trophy, dripping blood. Yes, it was political, but it was also theatrical. The concept of a woman who succeeded rather than merely surviving in a male-dominated world captivated these artists. Timaeus rose to prominence as a nationalist figure in places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan during the 19th and 20th centuries. She was reclaimed by poets and educators as a historical heroine, demonstrating the fiery, proud, and profoundly feminine origins of Central Asian identity. Her name was mentioned in military ceremonies, statues, and textbooks. Through myth and memory, through pride and rebellion, a lady who had once governed with a bow in her hand was riding again. Timaeus continues to be a problem in a society that still struggles with the concept of strong female characters. She was not docile, holy, or flawless. She was firm, cruel when needed, and only kind to those who merited it. The blood of empire on her hands was a crown she wore without apologies. She was resistance in human form. The people who create laws, erect monuments, and etch their names in stone are typically favored by history. None of these were done by Timaeus. Her name endures because she refused to be forgotten, not because she ruled indefinitely, but because she left no kingdom behind, no palace to unearth, and no royal seal to crack. She represents a contrast to how women are frequently remembered in history as forces of fate rather than as companions or incidental characters. Timaeus didn't plead for praise. With fire and blood, she took it. She was not a king's rider. She triumphed when she rode against one. Not just because she killed Cyrus the Great, but because she dared to challenge him. Her narrative is recounted in classrooms across Central Asia and Europe. She had no empire to defend. She was fighting for freedom, a freedom that could not be cleanly depicted on a map, that slept under the stars, that hunted with hawks and that rode on horseback. Today, her visage appears on coins and textbooks, and sculptures of her rise from Kazakhstan's capital cities. She is seen by contemporary Central Asians as a mother of nations, a connection to a proudly nomadic, pre-Islamic, and pre-Soviet past, and a reminder that their identity was forged in the roar of battle and the gallop of horses rather than in surrender. Because she taught her that dignity is not granted but rather seized, and that sometimes leadership looks like a mother grieving her son and refusing to let the killer walk away. Timaeus is a beacon in a world still divided by power, gender, and memory. We frequently question why some names endure while others disappear. At a time when women were supposed to vanish into men's tents, Timaeus stood tall, blade in hand, rage in her heart, and etched her story into the annals of history, which is why she lived. There, amid the whispering winds of the steppe, a queen still gallops unbroken, undefeated, and completely unforgettable. Empires fall, statues crumble, but legends ride. There was a more straightforward issue long before encryption keys and security cameras. How can I protect my belongings from inquisitive neighbors, roving animals, and would-be thieves? Possessions increased as human society transitioned from nomadic bands to sedentary civilizations, bringing with them issues, jealousy, theft, and the desire for security. We have an innate, even primordial instinct to defend the things we cherish. Humans had to figure out how to keep people out whenever they started keeping food, tools, or holy objects in permanent homes or temples. But when you can't keep watch indefinitely, how do you protect something? The solution? Create a system that will do it for you. About 4,000 years ago, in ancient Egypt, the first attempt at mechanical security was made. What's amazing is not just that they had locks, but also that the fundamental idea that led to their creation is still in use today. An early engineering marvel was the Egyptian hardwood pin lock. It made use of wooden pegs and a bolt with holes in it. The pegs rose when the key, typically a big wooden tool with matching pins, was inserted, enabling the bolt to slide open, extract the key, and gravity to put the pins back into position, sealing the door. This was nothing new. Temple gateways, tombs, and storage spaces all had these locks. To make tampering more difficult, they were frequently placed vertically on the inside of doors. Even though these early systems might appear archaic by today's standards, their fundamental logic is what makes them brilliant. They were puzzles rather than just boundaries, and like all excellent puzzles, they presented challenges to those who were not included. Furthermore, these locks provide a deeper insight into the personalities of their creators. They expected theft, not just feared it. They planned ahead. By devoting their time and expertise to safeguarding the important things, they established the foundation for a whole new area of human ingenuity: security. The next time you lock your front door, keep in mind that you are not merely twisting a deadbolt. Rather, you are carrying on a custom that was established by ancient hands and is motivated by an eternal truth. There are some things worth protecting. In addition to being the first lock ever discovered, the Egyptian wooden pin lock served as the model for almost all modern pin tumbler mechanisms. It began with a few pieces of wood, a little ingenious design, and a strong need for solitude. It was simple, elegant, and remarkably successful, serving temples, residences, and storage chambers throughout ancient Egypt for generations. Consider a massive wooden door that resembles a vertical plank barrier rather than one with hinges like those found today. There is a wooden bolt on the inside of that door that slides horizontally to block the entrance. However, the bolt has multiple holes in it, and a wooden peg is positioned within each hole. The bolt cannot slide open because those pegs fit into grooves carved into the door frame itself. It's secured. The magic is about to happen. The pegs or pins on the key, a big wooden tool that resembles a contemporary toothbrush, line up with the locations of those in the bolt. The pins within are pushed up just enough to clear the frame slots when the key is inserted into the bolt. The bolt can readily glide open after being raised. When the key is removed, gravity takes care of the rest. The door is relocked when the pins drop back into the frame holes. It's mechanical memory made of wood, weight, and creativity, no springs or gears. This system's ability to blend dependability and complexity was what made it so remarkable. Crafting it using the resources at hand was not too difficult, but without the right key it was difficult to get about. Additionally, keys were not interchangeable because each lock was hand-carved and slightly distinct. It was your lock. Nor were these pin locks exclusive to the wealthy or aristocratic. The idea extended widely throughout ancient civilizations as evidenced by archaeological discoveries at places like Nineveh and later in Persian and Assyrian locales. The lock had legs, but the concept may have originated in Egypt. In addition to their utilitarian value, these locks had symbolic significance. Locking something wasn't merely for physical security in tombs and places of worship. It represented respect, completion, and the idea that some things should not be altered unless you were deserving enough to hold the key. In ancient Egypt, security was a statement rather than merely a function. Ancient Mesopotamia invented a completely new kind of security that depended more on identity and less on mechanics, whereas Egypt provided us with the first mechanical locks. Bolts and tumblers were not the only security measures in place in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates. It was imprinted with power, trust, and symbols in clay. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians were among the peoples of Mesopotamia who devised a way to secure things that clearly prevented unwanted access, rather just locking them. How? Small carved stone rollers with distinctive pictures or inscriptions are accompanied by cylinder seals. These seals were used to shut doors, containers, and even official documents. They were rolled over wet clay. Consider it an antiquated mashup of a barcode, a wax seal, and a signature. The seal left a continuous pattern that was difficult to replicate after it was impressed into the clay. It was clear if someone had broken the door latch, opened the container, unwrapped the tablet, or interfered with the seal. They were exposed by the fractured clay. This method was straightforward but deep. In a world without alarms or padlocks, it emphasized visibility as a deterrent. The seal informed the world that you had something, but it didn't stop you from opening it. Priests, merchants, and high-ranking officials all had unique cylinder seals that were frequently handed down through the centuries. Because these seals were so prestigious, some persons were even interred with them as tools of the afterlife and status markers. However, clay was not the only factor in Mesopotamian security. Additionally, they used bindings made of rope that could only be torn off, frequently wrapped with intricate knots or seals that would be obvious signs of tampering. To safeguard temple coffers and granaries, the concept remained constant. Make the possibility of being discovered more terrible than the potential gain from stealing. For millennia, this idea of security as accountability, of tying access to a person's identity and social standing, would reverberate. We still use usernames to log in, employ signatures for verification, and rely more on records than locks. To be protected in Mesopotamia meant more than simply keeping something hidden. Its purpose was to openly declare who was authorized to handle it. Ancient Greek city-states' demand for personal security increased along with their riches and complexity. From coin-filled storerooms and private houses to temple coffers, the Greeks had to deal with the same ancient problem. When you can't be present to protect things all the time, how can you keep them safe? Remarkably, the Greeks developed mechanical locks at a slower pace than their counterparts in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Rather, they relied largely on physical obstacles, social norms, and trust, which were occasionally strengthened by remarkably ingenious but crude mechanisms. The bar and pin lock, which was mostly used on chests and doors, was one such invention. In order to raise the bar, a key was entered from the outside via a hole in a horizontal bar that was positioned across a door on the inside. Large, flat iron rods in the shape of the letters F or P were frequently used as these keys. They weren't very covert. Some were nearly as long as a forearm. In fact, it was pretty clear that you had something to defend when you carried one around. Greek locks and keys, however, were more than merely practical. They were also important to culture. Being given a key represented power and accountability. As a representation of her authority in the home, Penelope is said to possess the key to Odysseus's storeroom in Homer's Odyssey. Greek locks, however, had drawbacks. They frequently lacked nuance, were easily coerced, and relied more on physical size. The mix of guards, concealment, and social expectations was frequently what actually kept treasures safe. The city-state held several keys to the rope and wax-sealed rooms in temples and state treasuries, and opening a sacred store required the presence of several officials. Even houses were built with several rooms, layered access, restricted entry points, and gates that could be locked from the inside. Rich households might use hired guards or slaves to keep an eye on valuables, giving the comparatively basic mechanical devices a human layer of security. Unlike later civilizations, the Greeks did not yet apply their admiration for wit, metes, or crafty intelligence to the craft of lockmaking. Nevertheless, they established the foundation for culture. Keys serve as status symbols, access is a question of trust, and security strikes a balance between social control and strength. If the Greeks incorporated trust into tradition and the Egyptians gave us the idea for the pin lock, it was the Romans who really made lockmaking a useful skill. The Romans contributed accuracy, mobility, and invention to ancient security through their mastery of metallurgy, obsession with order, and extensive bureaucracy. Their concepts are still reflected in contemporary locks. Compared to its wooden counterparts, Roman locks were far more durable and could have smaller, more complex designs since they were mainly composed of iron and bronze. They used the Egyptian pin tumbler concept, but they made it smaller, better, and sometimes entirely new. Roman locksmiths invented ward locks, which employed internal barriers, or wards, that only permitted a key with the right form to turn and open the mechanism. This implied that merely putting in any instrument would not be effective. The internal layout and the key had to coincide. By the way, their keys were themselves wonders. From massive staff-like keys used for city gates to exquisitely wrought ring keys worn on the finger like jewelry, Roman keys were made of iron or bronze and came in a variety of sizes. These ring keys were more than just stylish. They fulfilled a practical necessity by providing continuous access to locked cabinets or boxes without requiring the carrying of heavy equipment. It was a combination of practicality and status wrapped in metal. But Roman puzzle locks, intricate systems concealed within elaborate boxes where turning the wrong angle or pressing the wrong latch would not just fail, were the true ingenuity. It could tighten the lock's trap. In addition to protecting treasures, these were also used to conceal papers, religious artifacts, or even poison, a common tactic in Roman politics. Lock usage was likewise established by the Romans. Locks were utilized in military storerooms, trade chests, granaries, and banks. Gates featured locking bars, doors had metal plates, and even slaves might be secured with iron collars that only their lords could access. A lock was more than just a tool to the Romans. It was a declaration. It proclaimed exclusion, authority, and ownership. It also spawned the notion that a genuinely civilized society required more than fortifications to keep it safe. Systems were required. Ancient China followed a route that combined pragmatism and philosophy, while the West was creating elaborate metal locks. Ever practical, Chinese engineers created straightforward, long-lasting, and frequently symbolic locking systems, where a lock's design had more significance than merely protecting an object. The sliding bolt lock, a mechanism mainly composed of iron or bronze, was the most widely used type of ancient Chinese lock. Usually a sliding bolt was held in place by spring-loaded tumblers inside a hollow metal box. The tumblers would line up if you inserted the proper key, which is often a flat, ridged metal stick. This would enable the bolt to slide and the lock to open. Does that sound familiar? It ought to. As early as 200 BCE in Han Dynasty China, the fundamental idea of the contemporary pin-tumbler lock was already in existence. Chinese locks were small, unobtrusive, and portable in contrast to Roman locks, which frequently had external keyholes and ornate accents. Function was prioritized over form, and many were used to lock doors, jewelry boxes, gates, and chests. Chinese locks, however, were more than just mechanical locks. They were frequently etched with symbols signifying riches, luck, or protection, or cast in the shapes of animals, tigers, dragons, or turtles. To represent abundance, a fish-shaped lock could be affixed to a money box. There was more to a dragon lock on a door than just security. It alerted invaders that what was beyond was protected by a strong force. Locks served ceremonial purposes as well. Love locks were occasionally used to link chests or symbolic boxes during weddings to symbolize the couple's bond. As part of the marriage ceremony, the key would be passed over as a sign of commitment and confidence. The purpose of some locks, especially puzzle locks, was to deceive burglars. They bought time rather than making them more difficult to breach, which is why they had concealed mechanisms, fake keyholes, or required a particular set of movements to open. Delay used to be the difference between a successful and unsuccessful theft. In the end, the foundation of Chinese security culture was harmony between practicality, symbolism, and astute design rather than the harsh denial of access. They created a silent legacy in that fusion of form and function, one that is still carried on today in symbolic rituals and understated hairstyles. Security in ancient India was more about deft concealment, symbolic barriers, and layered defense that combined creativity and spirituality than it was about using physical force. Indian hair was used for more than just keeping people out. Their purpose was to deceive, confound, and warn. They frequently included false compartments, secret latches, or symbolic inscriptions to make security seem almost philosophical. The use of deceit was one of the most notable aspects of Indian lockmaking. Temples and treasure chests began to use puzzle locks and clever devices, not to completely forbid brute force entry, but to make it difficult enough to deter it. Some locks required you to twist a second lever, hit a hidden button, and then wait for the key to turn. Others had fake keyholes that were just there to fool those who were invited. Intricate uses were particularly seen in temple security. Gold offerings, holy books, and prized artifacts were kept in temples. Priests frequently added layers of security, both physically and ceremonially, rather than merely concealing these behind barred doors. Wax, knotted rope, and a stamped clay emblem, all of which carry spiritual significance, may be used to seal a storage space. It was more than simply a crime to break that seal. It was seen as a sin. Religious imagery was often carved on the locks themselves: deities, lotus blossoms, elephants, and chants of protection. These were intended to give the object metaphorical armor, in addition to frightening the superstitious. In many instances, it was considered an insult to the gods themselves to handle such a lock without authorization. Scrolls, trade boxes, and private doors were secured with tiny, movable locks in Indian royal courts and commercial caravans. Usually made of brass or iron, these were designed to be strong and lightweight. Absolute security via obscurity was ensured by the highly customized key design, which was occasionally so distinctive that a single artisan was in charge of both the lock and its corresponding key. Additionally, locks occasionally had ceremonial purposes, just like in other parts of Asia. The opening of a sealed chest in marriage or inheritance ceremonies signified the passing of trust, legacy, and responsibility, in addition to providing access to material wealth. The best lock in ancient India did more than just block. It safeguarded, perplexed, and whispered that only those who were entitled may pass. There was an increasing demand for portable protection as civilizations expanded and trade networks extended from Rome to China. Ancient locks had to do more than just secure doors or temples. They also had to protect the war chest of a general or the merchandise in a merchant's caravan. They had to go. The ancient world had a thriving trade. Silk traveled from China to the west. India was a major source of spices. Continents were bridged by scrolls, currency, glassware, and textiles. But risk accompanied wealth. Roads were frequented by bandits, items were stolen by dishonest porters, and valuables were transferred frequently without the owner's presence due to long-distance travel. The answer? Compact, strong, and difficult to tamper with locks. Roman traders frequently secured warehouse doors, saddlebags, and chests with tiny iron padlocks. These locks had ring keys and spring-loaded mechanisms that were lightweight enough for travel, but strong enough to withstand minor theft. They were discovered rusted shut on shipwrecks or buried in ruins from Britain to Syria. Their pervasiveness illustrates a universal concern, safeguarding mobile riches. Portable sliding locks, frequently composed of bronze, were used by Chinese officials and businessmen to secure boxes or carts. Some had engraved symbols or inscriptions indicating ownership, and some were expertly camouflaged to look ornamental or embedded within the box itself. In addition to being evident, breaking the lock could result in both criminal and dishonorable prosecution. Additionally, Central Asian nomadic peoples created leather and metal clasp systems that allowed metal rings and latches to be fastened or secured to weapon cases, horse bags, and tent flaps. Despite their simplicity, these systems placed a strong emphasis on visibility and quickness. If a traveler's belongings had been affected, they would know right away. And in combat, command tents, treasury wagons, and weapon depots were frequently equipped with locks. Controlling access to information as well as resources was essential during a war. In an early kind of two-factor authentication, scrolls and maps were occasionally locked in boxes that required many officers to access due to multi-key systems. One thing was the same throughout civilizations. The need for more inventive locks grew as the world got more mobile. Ancient travelers used keys in addition to swords to combat the danger and opportunity that the road presented. We almost ever consider the hundreds of years of silent creativity that went into the simple act of tapping a code into a lock screen or twisting a key in a door. However, each click, lock, and password tells a tale that started in the quiet commerce lanes that bound the ancient world together, in the dust of Egyptian temples and in the bronze workshops of Rome. Ancient locks have left behind a psychological as well as a mechanical legacy. Our innate drive to define what is ours, to exclude others, and to protect ourselves is reflected in these early creations. The idea was the same, whether it was a puzzle lock in Chang'an, a wooden bolt in Thebes, or a ring key in Pompeii, to establish a barrier that only the legitimate owner could penetrate. Additionally, these boundaries changed over time, becoming symbols rather than just physical obstacles. In addition to protecting riches, a lock on a temple entryway preserved the sacred. A seal on a scroll signified power in addition to concealing knowledge. Even now, a closed diary, wedding trunk, or guarded vault are used to signify confidence. The meaning is the same even though the process is more sophisticated. The most amazing thing about ancient security, in many respects, is how little has changed. Egyptian designs are still reflected in contemporary pin-tumbler locks. Modern privacy seals, passcodes, and even blockchain security are echoes of traditional concepts like symbolic control, tamper-proofing, and personal access. However, there is also a philosophical twist. Older locks were never infallible, like now they might be broken, picked, or evaded. However, they had the authority to set boundaries as well as to barricade entry. "This is mine," they declared to the world. "You don't have authorization." And the core of security lies in that psychological line more than any technical component. The purpose of locks has always extended beyond preventing theft, from tombs to trade routes, from temples to residences. They have to do with identification, control, concealment, and occasionally survival. Therefore, keep in mind that you're not merely employing a tool the next time you hear a safe click shut or move a deadbolt. You're carrying on a tale that has been written by kings, traders, warriors, and priests, all of whom believed that a tiny piece of technology would keep the world from progressing.